Okay, my friends, good morning to all of you and welcome back. Here we are in the course of Fundamental Principles in Bioethics within the program of the Master of Bioethics at St. Thomas University. Beginning as always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in us the fire of your divine love. In the name of Christ our Lord. Amen. Keep in mind in a special way in our prayers the people of Central America with this crazy storm that has gone in and out of Central America like a little hook. The parish where I live has quite a few people from Central America, and one lady from Guatemala was telling me that it has been raining for so many days that the whole country is just saturated with rain, and it's a mountainous region, so there has been landslides, yes, and some towns are isolated. They cannot get to them, even with helicopter. Helicopter has nowhere to land, so it's pretty disastrous down there in Central America. We'll keep him in our prayers at this time. And we hope that this hurricane may dissipate soon. Okay, it's late in the season already. Anyway, let's see. So any questions or comments from previous material or anything at all? All right, how about on the booklet of responsible research and professional conduct? Have you been reading that, summarizing the chapters? All right, 13 little chapters to summarize. Don't delay it because I need to put a grade on it, all right? Okay, so if you have any questions or comments about that, let me know. Maybe next class we can devote a little time to have some discussion if you have any particular questions or comments about the reading material. All right, basically we have 2 lectures to go, this one and next one, okay? So hopefully we'll be done before Thanksgiving. And then what I'm hoping is if the weather gets a little better, that maybe the first Sunday of December, we can get out to the field and show you a little bit what the research that we're doing there with forest management and reforestation of the slash pine forest. And this will be like a little primer for the environmental bioethics course in the summer. Okay. So basically what we're doing now is we're shifting to the theological aspect of bioethics, having spent quite a few lectures on the scientific side of things, looking at evolution in general first and the basic principles that are governing evolution, this process of which we see the results. We don't see it in taking place actually, because it's down to the molecular level at every single individual organism that is living. Basically, that every organism has a genotype and a phenotype, right? And the genotype is always susceptible to what? To one of the 4 forces, which is really what begins the potential for evolution. And we're down to the molecular level here, mutation. Mutation of the DNA sequence, or if it's an RNA organism, like in the case of some viruses, then that would be the RNA. But basically, at the level of genotype, which is hidden, right? It's a double hiding, if you will. Not only is it hidden within the cell, it's hidden also within the nucleus of the cell. So very, very protected. However, mutations do occur for a series of reasons, and they are typically random, sporadic, unless we cause them, right? But in nature, they are random and sporadic, and there's a background rate of mutation that occurs in nature on every organism. And that is the beginning of the potential, right? Because then if that mutation is significant, let's say in the coding region, may code for slightly variant on the protein. That would be the first level of phenotype, right? The amino acid sequence. And that may cause some variant characteristic on the organism itself. And then at the other end of the scale, which is the force that actually makes the evolution happen, the force that actually makes the evolution happen, the force that acts on variance, selection, natural selection, right? And so we see that this has, the mutations have the potential for causing variance, and then selection may act on those variants depending on fitness in the environment. All right, so those were basic principles that apply to all living organisms. And then we zeroed in on human evolution, looking at, just like we did for general evolution, the first line of evidence, the most obvious evident thing is what? Fossil record, the fossil record, all right? And we look at that and we see skulls of hominins, right? That are somewhat similar, but not exact to our own current species. And the most prized fossil that can be found in general for any species, but in particular for the human species, is what part of the body? The skull. The skull, because that may tell us something about the brain capacity of that individual. And then there are a lot of assumptions that go on in the fossil record, right? And one big assumption is that the fossil that we find is actually the representative, is the most representative of that species. But it doesn't have to be. It could be that we actually found a variant that is way off the mean, one of those on the tails, assuming that there's a normal distribution, which is the typical distribution in nature. Distribution of what? When we talk about a normal bell-shaped distribution of variance, distribution of variance within each species. And keep in mind that the variations can be precisely at those four levels, right? The morphological level, the shape, the physiological level, metabolism, the behavior of the organism. They can have the same morphology, the same physiology, but behave differently, right? And then the most detailed level is going to be down to the molecular level. So these are variations that occur in each individual within a population of the same species. So applying those same principles to human by way of our organic life, we see that organically we're not different from nature. We still have to eat and sleep and do all the functions, the organic biological functions that other organisms do, right? Because we metabolize. And that's how we can define basically life at the organic level, is with our metabolism. In fact, we see when metabolism stops and there's breakdown, there's decay and chaos, then that's the death process for any organism. All right, so applying those principles to human, and we see that the fossil record corroborates some transition, right? And there are levels of transition. First, with the primates, about anywhere between the broad window 5 to 8 million years ago, narrow 6 to 7 million years ago with the other primates. Basically, the other three species that are represented in the primates, order Primata, right? Which are the orangutan, the gorilla, and the chimp. And then the nearest to us, phylogenetically, is the chimp, and that divergence was 2 to 3 million years ago, okay? And then going forward, we see on the hominin line, right, this, that is a category of tribe. Tribe is between what and what on the biological classification. The Linnaean classification, binomial classification, tribe is below family and above genus, right? In between family and genus. So on the family, we are hominids with a D. and then that can be further subdivided before we get to the genus Homo, with the hominins. And there we find that divergence between about 2 million years ago on the more narrow side. So once we get down to the genus Homo, we see at least 6 different species that have been identified by the paleoanthropologists, those who study ancient fossils. And we are the only living species, right? Coexisting at least with the one closest to us, the fossil Neanderthal in Europe, up to about 40,000 years ago, which is really fairly recent, all right? We're down to the thousands of years, much smaller than millions of years, okay? So there's some progression there, but there's still gaps in the fossil record and in the transition. And that's why, going back to Darwin, he kind of shied away from species and just looked at variants all over the place, right? So we can say that there are all these variants on the hominin side down to the genus level of the various homos. I really don't know if Darwin would have considered, I mean, these discoveries were made since Darwin. Their discoveries mostly from the beginning of the 20th century, the 1900s, early 1900s, a big family down there in South Africa, the Leakey family. I don't know if you've heard of Leakey, L-E-A-K-Y. You can look it up. It's a whole family of archaeologists and anthropologists who devoted their lives to looking at these fossils and discovered quite a few of them in South Africa and Equatorial Africa, mostly on the eastern side, whereas Somalia and Ethiopia today and so forth. But those seems to be our origin anthropologically as at the level of the genus, at the level of Homo, all right? And we, as far as we can tell, are the only living species of that Homo with a single population throughout the whole world. Just kind of summarizing things here on the big picture. So now the converse of the question is, how do we reconcile this evidence of fossil record and phylogenetics and percentage homology with other living species, but particularly with the most close relatives of the primates, with our faith, with the fact that, the belief, I should say, the belief that we have been created in God's image and that we have been created with an individual soul projected to live eternally in the presence of God, the Blessed Trinity, in communion with the angels and saints for all eternity. All right, how do we reconcile this? And we notice that on this side of belief, what I'm saying is that not only are science and religion reconcilable, perfectly well reconcilable, but actually they complement each other, because the whole process of evolution and nature as we understand it is a how process of matter, of material things, all right, and material beings. So it's a process of how, whereas our faith will give us answers as to why. And the big questions, the biggest questions that only we humans can ask, as far as we can tell from all the other organisms, why are we here? Where did we come from and where are we going ultimately, right? And that big question people are asking themselves, particularly during these times of pandemic and other, we got human and natural disasters going on in more than one way. Why are we here? You know? All right, so it begs the question to look at some capacities that we have, specifically two very big capacities that we have, which are our reason and will to actually consider this existence. No other organism that we can tell from their behavior mostly is aware of their existence as we are, okay? To the point that we have radars out there and satellites in space that are scanning the universe for any possible meteorite or asteroid that will be coming our way anytime soon. So imagine if the dinosaurs had something like that, they may have tried to protect themselves from what happened to them, but they didn't. He wiped them out. In fact, we have evidence of these 5 mass extinctions that have occurred since the beginning of life on Earth, right? And as I mentioned, mass extinction, keep in mind that that in itself, as catastrophic as it is, when we talk about mass extinction, some organisms have to survive, right? It's not that all life is totally, absolutely wiped out 100%. Typically, the most fit, on average, did survive, and if it's just a few organisms of some species, even though entire species were wiped out in the mass extinctions. But those that manage to survive typically have very open niches to them. And then that leads to what is known as expansive radiation, right? And again, we were not exempt from that, mostly as mammals that took over the niche that was open when the dinosaurs were wiped out about 60 to 70 million years ago, more or less. All right, so where does that leave us? It leaves us with considering what our faith tells us about ourselves, our origin, again, phylogenetically and ontogenetically. Phylogenetically as a whole species, and ontogenetically individually, which we'll look at in a couple of months when we start the beginning of life course, all right? So again, back to the faith and our belief. When we try to get to the root of that, we're going to come up with basically the Bible. In other words, our sacred book for the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? Which is 2 of the 3 monotheistic religions of the world. So let's put it a little bit in context of polytheism and monotheism. Remember how I had mentioned, let me see if I have some, no. Give me a minute, see if I can raise the slide from last lecture. It's a little informative there. When I was pointing out to some events like burying the dead. And we know from several lines of evidence that primitive humans, Homo, inhabited caves, right, throughout the world. And a number of these caves have been discovered, explored. It's still a very active line of research going on in cave exploration. Other animals did, but other animals kind of inhabited caves more temporarily. Humans seem to have inhabited caves more on a permanent basis. And so those were the first dwellings that we had at the, again, the level of Homo, at the genus level. And eventually we started building huts and other habitats out of the caves, especially in places where caves are not readily found, right? Open range and so forth. But what is left behind in these caves is known as material culture. Material culture, whether they are human remains or artifacts and stuff, cargo that was left behind, tools that were used, and so forth, including the campfires that were made that with more sophisticated technology nowadays, these campfires are a trove of a wealth of information. They tell us what they were eating and so forth, okay? And also the issue of clothing, of which I'll touch a little bit today, but mostly next class. Clothing is a very interesting phenomenon because we observed that only humans wore clothing, all right? So that's an interesting hint of when we started phylogenetically and why wear the clothing. Have at least a couple of different reasons for that. All right, so what I was trying to say here is monotheistic cultures. We also know, mostly from art, primitive art, we can maybe do a little search here on cave art. I mentioned Altamira, or cave art or cave paintings, right? They're kind of enigmatic. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to minimize this because it gets in the way of the videos and the slides. Right. Did anyone have a chance to look at that film Altamira? No? Okay. If you have a chance, I keep bringing it up because it's very well done. These were caves in, these are mostly the Altamira bulls and other large mammals that were found mostly in caves throughout Spain and Europe, but other parts, Spain and France. Lescaut is another one. I think this is from Lescaut. Looks like some kind of a, maybe a lion or a mountain lion. Okay, it's mostly mammals, which were, the herbivores were of course herds, and they were fairly abundant. There are also some caves in Australia that have these pictograms. Many of the pictograms are, how did I say, figures, either figures of animals, typically animals, or humans, and sometimes these palms that are enigmatic, they are powdered in typically 3 colors of brown, ochre, and black. And they put the palm and then they put powder around them. And then sometimes they also fill in with little dots or lines. Enigmatic, but paleoanthropologists who study these things tell us, and these happen in different parts of the world, that in principle, it's hard to consider that these tribes of humans, of Homo, were connected to each other. Well, these are Homo sapiens, all right? These are all Homo sapiens. But they were isolated from each other, different subpopulations, and yet they come up with the same type of design generally in different parts of the world. So it's considered that this had some kind of mythical, religious, superstitious meaning to them, all right? Maybe to try to capture the soul or the spirit of the animal so that they can hunt them down better. Or maybe perhaps some kind of reference toward the animal because these animals were keeping them alive. Who knows? But they're very enigmatic. But it's considered that, and they occur in many different places throughout the world, in populations that we have no evidence that they were ever directly connected to each other. So this may be pointing at then associated with perhaps some things that look like ritualistic, feathers attached to a stick, for example, that had no practical use, right? What do you use feathers attached to a stick for? And these were typically feathers of birds of prey, large birds, predators like eagles and hawks and so forth. So kind of the assumption there is that these were some kind of ritual that they were doing. Now we find no ritual in any other animal, living or in the fossil record, okay? And yet, when we start putting this picture together of the cave art, together with the material culture of artifacts that have no hunting purpose or feeding purpose or anything that would be practical, right? They could be toys, for example, we don't know. And then associating that together with the tombs, with the burial sites, and even some artifacts that were found in those burial sites, perhaps not these two specifically, but in other caves or in other burial sites, we do find some of these material culture artifacts laid around in the tomb. The logical conclusion is that they had some kind of rituals. They had rituals that were a combination of myth and superstition. Even to this day, there are a number of religions in Africa that are called animist religions. And these animist religions basically attribute magical powers and superpowers to natural phenomena, as for example, a big rain downpour, or lightning, or even fire, okay? They attribute some magical powers or some deity to these natural phenomena. Of course, these are definitely pre-scientific societies. They had no clue that lighting is caused by the friction of the atmosphere with the surface of the earth and things like that, okay? And that heavy rain is simply the accumulation of water molecules around some kind of a core nucleus that makes them precipitate and so forth. They had no clue of gravity, even though they were all subject to it. We do today, so we can explain away these natural phenomena, as drastic as they may seem, hurricanes and huge forces, even the changing, imagine something as drastic as changing the polarity of the earth periodically from north to south. That is really dramatic. We have not experienced that in our civilization. And it would generally cause chaos, a lot of the electronics that we have, right? Changing the polarity of the earth, but that does happen, and there's evidence of that, mostly from magnetic rocks that are laid out in the sediment of the bottom of the ocean. They're literally swaths or rows of positive and negative orientation on the surface of the earth that coincide with the changing of the polarity of the earth. But even that today, we could certainly explain it as some kind of a natural phenomenon. Back then, no, they didn't have this level of scientific sophistication. So they attributed to gods, to the gods. So what I'm trying to say by all this is that the first emergence that we have of some kind of ritual, some kind of religion or belief, right, beyond the natural, in other words, into the supernatural, was that they were deities. They were these powers that were beyond the earth. And so polytheism, the belief in several gods, was the original belief of these different cultures throughout the world, without being specific to anyone. But we see we see the telltales of it. It's like, you know, 1,000 years from now, finding religious art and religious artifacts, like for example, in a sacristy of a church, where we find chalices and host and wine and so forth that are used in the ritual of a Catholic Mass, right? So we could tell a lot from examining those things, even to the point of how the ritual was done. Now, so the first original belief, it makes sense that it was polytheistic, that all these manifestations that were dramatic were different deities. They were manifestation of the gods, and some gods were good, some were bad. For example, generally rain was good because it made things grow and so forth. But then when it got too much and it got to a downpour and deluge and floods, then it turned into bad. And you notice that in the Bible, a lot of those narratives seeped into the Bible to the point of the flood, the great flood, all right, that wiped out. It was like a second beginning for humans, still in the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible. That is one of the longest one, has 50 chapters. We'll look at that in more detail next class. Basically, polytheism then is the first line of belief of these primitive humans. They're already in the sapiens, at least that we know of sapiens. We don't have any evidence that I know of on the Neanderthal side that for religious beliefs as far as rituals and so forth. But again, I confess that I'm not an expert in that. But because Neanderthal is extinct, you know, we can say, well, so what? At least we're looking at the current species of sapiens, which is, we're tracing the phylogeny of Homo sapiens. All right, so polytheism, and that was the standard belief throughout millennia up until the time of the Jewish people, which could have been 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years before the time of Christ. We don't know exactly, but probably anywhere in that frame between 2,000 and 4,000 years. okay? Actually, they are counting for the Jewish people, the Orthodox line, the more rigorous beliefs. They are in the year about 5,000 something, no? For the Jewish people, in the year 5,000 something. So to them, they started about 3,000 years before the time of Christ, right? The whole event of Abraham, the father of the three monotheistic religions. I'll get to that in a minute. Basically, polytheism was a standard in many of these cultures, and even great civilizations that developed before the time of Christ, centuries and sometimes millennia before the time of Christ. We have evidence of very sophisticated civilizations like the Egyptians, the Hindu, the Chinese dynasties. Amazing. They had invented gunpowder, they had invented writing and ink, they had invented paper, oh, you name it, many things in the Chinese dynasties before the time of Christ, centuries and maybe even millennia, all right? So many of these cultures, the standard was polytheism, to believe in many gods that have become even sophisticated. Here in Mesoamerica also, even though there are fewer cultures that are before the time of Christ, maybe there was a focus in Mesoamerica of one of the origins of civilization, together with the origin of civilization in the Fertile Crescent, and then another one in what is today China, about three main foci of civilization independent from each other, several thousand years before the time of Christ. But the standard for all of these religions, and some of them got pretty sophisticated, all right, was polytheism. They believe in many gods, several gods, even up until the time of Christ. And that's where I want to bring it up to the time of Christ. The large sophisticated cultures in the Middle East and Europe, of course, Greece and Rome. Greek and Rome had elaborate polytheistic beliefs, the Greek mythology, which is very rich. And there's a lot of evidence of that, even in writings. And the Romans basically accepted, they took in most of Greek mythology. They just changed the names of the gods, all right, to Latinize them. But they had one thing that the Romans did was when they conquered a new town or a new civilization, all right, they would take over, they would impose their own overarching system, the Roman system of laws and so forth, but they left the local politicians in place, right, to keep the peace. And they also left the local religion in place. And not only that, they even brought, I'm talking about the Romans during the height of the empire, several hundred years before the time of Christ, they even brought different figurines of the idols of those civilizations and cultures. They would bring them to Rome to emphasize Rome as the capital of the world, of the known world back then. And so there was a huge building that was dedicated to all of these different figurines, all of these idols. Is known as the Pantheon in Rome, in downtown historical Rome. And so different people from these cultures would go to Rome on pilgrimage to pay respect to their gods, to their idols who were in this Pantheon. And that's what Pantheon means, Pantheos. Theos is a reference to God, Dios, that's where we get the word Dios in Spanish, in Latin, okay, Theo. And Pan, P-A-N, means many or several or all of the gods. So Pantheon was the place of all the gods. And that's how they were able to keep the peace. They didn't mess around with politics or religion at the local level, all right? But they made sure to collect taxes. And those taxes, of course, went to Rome for maintaining the empire. And as an exchange for taxes, they provided peace, the Roman law, which was the law of the centurion and the sword. And so they kept peace in these local places. All right, so then we have the emergence of monotheism, first that we know of, with Judaism, all right? Because God, Yahweh, actually makes a covenant with the Jewish people. And the Jewish people also simultaneously had the insight of one God, okay? And so there is a transition there from polytheism to monotheism. Even though we can also say that for polytheism, at least when it gets more elaborate, like the Egyptians, for example, or the Hindu cultures, or even Greece and Rome, there was typically one main god or one main goddess, all right? And the others were demigods and so forth, but there was one main fellow who had more power than the others. But the Jewish people basically came to the insight that God or gods have to have certain attributes, right? For example, or powerful, or knowledgeable, or willing, right? And those are attributes that we call omni in the Latinized version. So omnipotent is all-powerful, omniscient from science is all-knowing, and omnivolent is all-willing, right? These are attributes to God. If God was all-powerful, for example, had to be one God. Because if gods are going to share their power, then none of them are all-powerful. They're all partially powerful. You see, so it's kind of a logical conclusion that if God is all-powerful, then it has to be one God, right? If he shares power, then he's not almighty. Mm-hmm. So that insight, which also according to their tradition, which is also ours because we inherit, you see, we are the Judeo-Christian tradition, you know, it was also kind of illuminated and reinforced by God's revelation to them, by Yahweh, which is their Hebrew word for God, for the Almighty. Yahweh's communication with the Jewish people, especially in what is known as the covenant. The covenant. I will be your God and you will be my people, right? And that covenant is made with this fellow called Abraham, which is considered to be, he is the father of nations, of the monotheistic religions. Eventually, about 3,000 years later, according to the Jewish calendar, that God becomes incarnate in the person of Jesus Christ. And so we have a manifestation, what we call a revelation of divinity that becomes human, becomes humanity. And so, and this God-man, whom we call Jesus Christ, manifests a third person of the Trinity, as if two was not confusing enough. There's a third person who we call the Holy Spirit, all right? Very enigmatic, because at least God the Father, well, we all have a father, we all have a biological father, and so we have some intuition of what a father is and the characteristics of the father: creator, benevolent, etc., provider, in the best case scenario. And then the son, well, we're all children of the father and the mother, right? So, and the fact that the son becomes incarnate, even more so, he takes on our flesh. But the Holy Spirit, very, very mysterious of the person, but according to our belief, there are these three divine persons in one God. So even though the Jews don't consider us monotheistic, we consider ourselves monotheistic. And that's thanks to Greek reasoning, which I'll provide in a minute. But I want to stay with the line of thought here that the covenant that God makes with Abraham is this covenant: I will be your God, you will be my people. So it's what we call the chosen people of Israel, all right? The beginning of monotheism, as far as we can tell, and even the surrounding cultures stay with polytheism, as rich as the rituals are. We can say in respect and humility that they are confused as far as that is concerned, because again, if God is all powerful, it has to be one God, all right? And so a distance is established between the deity and the humanity that is kind of an infinite distance, right? Between Almighty God and human beings, which are mortal and so forth. But still, the belief in an afterlife prevails, even though there are two main groups of thoughts in Judaism, which are represented by the Pharisees and the Sadducees, who prevailed even unto the time of Christ, and they were powerful. They kind of took turns on the Sanhedrin, which was equivalent to like Congress for us today. They were, and also, but it conflated also Congress and the Supreme Court in a sense that they also made judgment. They made the laws and they made the judgment on the laws and so forth. Today, that Sanhedrin for the Jewish people is called the Knesset, which is their parliament. At any rate, the Sanhedrin, there were the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right? And we know from the Bible, and even the New Testament, and Jesus interacting with these two groups, that the Pharisees believe in eternal life and the Sadducees did not believe in eternal life. So apparently it was not a strict requirement to believe in eternal life to be a Jew, at least for the Sadducees. And there was a contention between them. So much so that Paul placed that in between the two when he's going to go to trial, you know, and he says, because I have, like the Pharisees, he says, I have belief in the resurrection. And then that gets the Pharisees and the Sadducees who were judging him, gets him into a brawl and even a fist fight in the middle of the court of the judgment. So he kind of, they take him away because it says there in the Bible, there was fear that they would tear him apart. So there are parts of the Bible that are very gutsy and juicy and interesting to get into because they describe, also it describes the local scenario of the time. We've seen, for example, the one parliament that gets very, very riled up is the British Parliament. And when they get into discussion in the House of Lords and all that, they've gotten into fistfights. And it's been on the news in our own time. At any rate, humanity is what it is with all its complexity. But again, the shift to monotheism, eventually, about 3,000 years later, that monotheism continues into the Christian tradition with Jesus Christ. Now, I want to introduce here how we're able to maintain three divine persons in one God. This is where the Hebrew tradition has a difficulty because they reject the categories of the Greeks. But as I'm thinking, I'm going to stop this argument there because it will be better illustrated in the second half of the lecture when we look at specific passages of the Bible in the book of Genesis, the first 10 chapters of the book of Genesis. Okay. For now, I just want to point out that the three monotheistic religions also have a little bit of a chronology to them, which is interesting from the theological perspective. Some of the stuff that I'm saying in this lecture is more on the theological side, so maybe it needs a little further background for those of you who may not have some philosophical, theological background, maybe more versed on the scientific side of things, on the empirical side. What I'm talking about is that Christianity chronologically, or the second monotheistic religion, chronologically appears on the scene with Jesus Christ about 2,000 years ago and about 3,000 years more or less after the first monotheistic religion, which is Judaism. You follow? But pretty much in the Middle East region, more or less in the same region of what is known as the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent is what is today Iraq and Iran and so forth. Mesopotamia back then. All right. Between the two big rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, these are two very large rivers that allow for the beginning of agriculture about 7,000 years ago, more or less. Is so we can say the agricultural origin of modern civilization is in this area of Mesopotamia. Okay, these rivers, they're all dammed and channeled now, the Tigris and the Euphrates, but they go through, I think, in fact, Baghdad, I think the Euphrates goes through Baghdad, or maybe it's Tigris, I forget. But it's known as the Fertile Crescent. This is the island of Cyprus, for example, for perspective. And this is the Arabian Peninsula here. And then the Nile River, of course, Egypt to this day at the La Desembocadura, the delta of the Nile, thank you. And then Africa over here, East Africa. all right? Where was I? Okay, so 2,000 years ago, the beginning of the second monotheistic religion with Christianity, and then about 400 years after that, 400 to 500 years after the birth of Christ, we have the birth of Muhammad, founding the third monotheistic religion, which is Islam. And that's why these three religions have Abraham as their father, and they are also known as Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Now, of course, Judaism and Islam do not consider us monotheistic, right? Because of the three divine persons. Maybe this would be a good time. I'm just kind of prefacing all of this stuff to get into the sacred book of the Bible, especially the Old Testament, and especially the book of Genesis. Yeah, so let me explain that now for a moment. I mentioned that the Jewish people were challenged by the Trinity, by the belief of the Trinity, even though there is hint of the Trinity in the book of Genesis and the first chapter precisely, when God says, let us make man in our image and likeness, that us, is a reference to a plurality of persons of the divine, three divine persons, or at least a plurality of persons. We didn't know there were three until the time of Christ. But how do we deal with that? We can deal with it at least rationally in this sense. It is the difference between nature and person. So I'm going to speak a little bit about philosophy here. Basically, the whole program is intertwined with three lines, which is the scientific line. That's the beauty of bioethics, that it's interdisciplinary, right? And it integrates empirical science, it integrates philosophy and theology, at least from the Catholic perspective. Secular bioethics, of course, leaves out the theological part. So they just stand on two legs, which tends to topple over, right? But three legs are very stable. At any rate, consider this philosophically, we make a distinction between nature and person, all right? These are philosophical categories. Just like, remember at the beginning when we talked about form follows function, and I said that empirically we know what the empirical scientists mean by form. They mean what? They mean shape, right? But not real form. In other words, the shape. And there's a whole science that studies the shape of things. It's called morphology, right? Anatomy and physiology. Anatomy is part of morphology, the shape of things. The structure of the thing is according to the function of the thing. If the arm is meant to bend, it needs to have a hinge somewhere. That's what we call the elbow. All right, so the structure of the thing is according to the function and not vice versa. All right, so what do we mean by form? Philosophically, form is the substance, the essence of things, I told you, whereas shape is our shape. And so, for example, we have in class here, physically, we have three different human shapes, right? We have three different human shapes. They're similar because we're all human, but we have how many forms, how many human forms? One human form, one human substance, one essence. Biologically, we call that the species. So we have one species, all right? That is also our nature. So how many persons here? Physically, we have three persons, all right? We have Carolina, we have Rogelio, and we have Father Chaffee. And then three more of you are out there virtually. Go down. Thank you. And here is Jorge, Chris, and Jordan. So the three of you are over there virtually, and you're three more persons, right? But how many natures? So, and we're all human persons, right? We're human persons. We're not orangutan persons or any other non-human person. Now, how many natures do we have? How many human natures do we have in here? We have one human nature. See, now these categories of person and nature come to us from Greek philosophy. all right, not from Judaism, but they come to us from Greek philosophy. So these are philosophical categories, nature and person, come to us from the Greeks. This is something that I found fascinating, the personal level, for Greece and classical Greece, which I mentioned are agricultural origin of Western civilization about 7,000 years ago in Mesopotamia, right? But our cultural origin is most likely classical Greece about 300 years ago, including Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, and Hippocrates, and all of the others, Euclides, and all of the scientists and mathematicians and astronomers that lived in classical Greece about 300 years before the time of Christ. And again, the Romans were the inheritors of that culture, that very, very advanced culture and civilization. What am I trying to say is that the Greeks had a very passionate religion, mythology, Greek mythology. The gods and the goddesses, all right, of Greek mythology, they were all very passionate. And they were passionate to the point that they mixed with the humans, and the humans were basically the puppets of the gods. And the gods were having fun with the humans, all right? And some gods became enamored, fell in love with women, with human women, and they had intercourse. And the result of that intercourse was the heroes. And I want to mention this: in Greek mythology, the heroes were human, but they had superhuman power. Like, for example, Hercules and Ulysses, and they had to do these works for the gods, all right? So I'm going to bring that, I mention it now as a preface, because then I'm going to look at that in the second part of the lecture with a specific passage in the I think it's in the 6th chapter of Genesis, where there's perhaps some oblique reference to Greek mythology. But basically, because so Greece, classical Greece, right, had this rich, elaborate mythology that was totally passionate. And it was also fatalistic. In other words, we humans were the pawns of the gods and the goddesses, and they were having fun with us, you know, but ultimately at our expense. We would die, we would be played with until we die, basically. So it was fatalistic, all right? And that's why the first type of theater that occurs, which has religious connotation, was the playing out of Greek mythology, Greek theater, which again was that's why I say it's the origin of Western civilization. We get theater, we get art from classical Greece, sculpture, for sure, right? What was the ideal body, the ideal proportions of the human body, which the head is anywhere between 7 to 8, the body is 7 to 8 times the size of the head, for example. They figured that out. I remember that from high school, studying that. At any rate, the mythology, the first type of Greek theater was the tragedy, So was the down face, right? The face with a frown, not a smile. Greek theater. The masks. And I'm going to talk about the mask, right? They represent, these two masks represent Greek theater, comedy, and tragedy. But tragedy was first in Greek theater, chronologically, okay? And then comedy came with satire, the satyrs, which were other semi-gods. But comedy came with a god, a Greek god, which was the god of wine. And he was Bacchus. Bacchus was the god of wine. And so during the vendimia, during the collection of the wine, during the harvest of grapes and the making of the wine and the tasting of the wine, the people would get drunk. In fact, I just noticed here, this could be a little grapevine, a cluster of grapes, right? Hanging from the head of Bacchus, but he's got little horns also. In other words, what happened was that when people got drunk, they got crazy. and they forgot about their tragedy, and they felt happy even to the point of death. So the second type of theater, Greek theater, was comedy, and it was most popular at the time of the harvest, and then the Bacchus was the god that reigned at that time, and so forth. And then finally, with more realism put into the scenario, all right, they noticed that life had its tragic moments, but it also had its happy moments. And so the more realistic type of representation of human life was the drama, all right? Like the novella, where you have tragedies and comedies, but the drama was the third more sophisticated, but it's getting away from the gods, and it was focusing more on the humans. But the original theater was really kind of a religious ritual, because it was a representation of the gods. I'll talk more about that and the person, the origin of person and the face, which is called prosopon in Greek, which is the mask. But I'm going to stop there on that line, because I'm going to pick it up for when we get to the beginning of life course next semester. All right. What I wanted to say was that the categories of nature and person come from Greek philosophy. Oh yes, and that. So whereas Greek mythology, which is their religion, was so passionate, totally emotional, right? Their philosophy was very rational. And so there's a big contrast there in Greek culture between their religion and their philosophy, that is, or their theology and their philosophy, which is the philosophy is very rational to the point that it's mathematical, and it leads to the discovery of geometry and trigonometry. They even were able to estimate not only that the earth was round, but that the circumference of the earth, okay, which is fascinating. And the temples that they built and the buildings of stone in the classical proportions. They give us the classical proportions to this day of what is perfect balance and harmony and all this. All right. Now, getting back to the Jewish people, they reject Greek culture, and in fact, it's called Hellenism. Hellenism is a reference to Greece, right? Because of their theology, their religion that is polytheistic. So the Jewish people are intent and almost obsessed on maintaining monotheism, the belief in one God, because that's according to the covenant. I will be your God in the singular, and you will be my people also in the singular, all right? Meaning that if the Jewish people wandered away from the belief in one God, then they're falling into idolatry, and that was an abomination, all right? It was one of the 3 capital sins at the time that deserved capital judgment and capital punishment. And the 3 capital sins were adultery, idolatry, and murder. And idolatry was also apostasy, in other words, the denial of the faith. So anyone caught in one of these 3 acts of adultery, murder, or apostasy, denial of the faith, of the one true faith, deserved capital punishment, and the capital punishment of the time was being stoned to death, even to the time of Christ. So we see a lot of the traditions that come up in the Bible were there in the oral tradition of the Jewish people before it was written. So these are traditions and anecdotes that were precursor to the written text. So there's an oral tradition before we get the written tradition of the actual books of the Bible, the 73 books of the Bible. So monotheism, in order to maintain the belief in one God, the Jewish people had to reject all of the cultural influence of Mesopotamia for thousands of years before the time of Christ, and then the Hellenistic influence of Greece centuries before the time of Christ, in spite of the fact that that was a great culture in other respects, especially philosophically. And so they reject these categories of nature and person, and that's why to this day they have a difficulty with the Trinity, whereas we talk about 3 divine persons, but 1 divine nature, one God, and 3 divine persons. Of course, it's still a mystery because this language is only what we call analogical language between us and God, because even though they are 3 divine persons, just like we are persons, we are human persons, the distance, we talk about the existential distance between God and us is an infinite distance. So there's an infinite distance between the divine persons and the human persons, all right? And yet they are persons as we are persons, okay? In other words, we attribute personality to them. Like we have an intuition that we are 3 different people right here, plus 3 others virtually. All right, all this rambling that I'm going on is to introduce us to the Bible, which is the book that has been most read throughout the world. It is a unique book. The genre of the Bible is many different genres, okay, because it spans several thousand years. The oldest book of the Bible, maybe 1,000 to 2,000 years before the time of Christ, and the most recent book of the Bible, maybe 100 to 120 years after Christ. So really, it's a collection. It's a collection of books, and it's actually the origin of the word Bible comes from Biblos, and I'll talk about the town of Biblos in a minute. But basically, the Bible as we know it today has 73 books. It's also been translated to most languages in the world. There are about 7,000 languages in the world, and the Bible has been translated to about 3,000 languages. No other book has been translated to so many languages, all right? So as we know the book today, the canon, what is known as the canon of the Bible, and the Bible is closed also in the sense that no books can be added or subtracted from it. On the Catholic tradition, it is 73 books. The Protestants, which is a tradition that started about 500 years ago, right? Beginning with Luther and others, Calvin and so forth in Europe, deny some of the books in the Bible. Significantly, for example, the book of James, the Epistle of James in the New Testament, because it places a lot of emphasis on works and we're saved by grace and so forth. So it gets into theological arguments, and it denies also some books of the Old Testament, but I'm sticking to the Catholic tradition here, which is the one that I know better. 73 books, of which 46 are in the Old Testament and 27 in the New. So it's almost twice as many books in the Old Testament, all right? And most of the Bible is really Old Testament. And we share many of these books with the Jewish people, and certainly the vast majority of them also with Protestants and the Orthodox, which are the other 2 branches, we say, of Christianity today. So a little bit of historical background also, because I have to mention that we have none of the originals of these 73 books, all right? We have, this is the bad news, is that we have none of the originals. The good news is that what we have is really oral traditions, and also there has been an oral tradition before the written tradition, okay? And so the tradition also counts for a lot, specifically in the Catholic side of biblical tradition. Excuse me. But first, the word itself, Bible, comes from a town called Byblos. And this town of Byblos, to this day, is on the coast of Lebanon, all right, of the city of the country of Lebanon today, which is, as you know, north of Israel, and Jordan is down here, Syria, there's Israel, and then Saudi Arabia would be over here. In this town of Byblos, there was a library that collected papyri for centuries, as far as they can tell. So the Mediterranean is a very ancient sea and has been bordered by civilization for centuries, for millennia actually. Beginning with the coast of Africa and the delta of the Nile, which was a very fertile area, and the Egyptian civilization there, centuries, maybe several millennia before the time of Christ, okay? And the Middle East, also a number of civilizations there, the Medes, the Persians, Greece, and the Peloponnesus region of all the islands, the Greek islands, the Aegean Sea, not to mention Italy, Rome, Imperial Rome, and all the civilizations that surrounded the Mediterranean for millennia. There was basically a two-way traffic of commerce that was going on, ships along the coast, either clockwise or counterclockwise, hitting all these ports of call, and a lot of trade was going on between Africa, the Middle East, and Europe along the Mediterranean coast, either clockwise or counterclockwise, all these ships going around with trade, with a lot of rich cargo, including parchments and papyri, right? That here we can see, interestingly, the technique of making the paper, which is a papyrus reed. It's a plant that grows in marshes, mostly originally along the coast of Africa and the delta of the Nile. And this reed can be opened up, lit, and then open and dried out, and then weaved in a reticular fashion to make essentially a piece of paper, the original paper, all right? And so we have two writing places, the papyrus, which is vegetable origin, or the parchment, which is a skin of an animal. Both, as you can see, are organic material that tend to deteriorate with time, all right? Typically decades, it's hard for maintaining any of these into even centuries, but within decades, they're deteriorated because it's organic material. But anyway, this library that had the fashion of collecting papyri of different cultures and civilizations throughout the Mediterranean, and then inroads, because keep in mind, towns and nations that were inland, they would migrate to the coast for trade, right? And so even there are parchments and papyri that came from other towns and civilizations that were inland and very rich. And that library was in the town of Byblos, and so it was called a biblioteca. That's where we get the word library, biblioteca in Spanish. One book was found there that was this book of the Bible. In other words, it had these books contained in it, and this was several centuries after Christ, but this book was found in this town, and so that's why the origin of the name Bible comes from both the town of Byblos, but also the fact that in ancient Egyptian, a papyrus is called a bublos, all right? A bublos, and that is in Egyptian. And so, and the U and the Y, I guess, got interchanged at some point. But that's the origin of the word itself. So it's an the Bible is a reference, the actual word Bible, the noun, is a reference to a collection of papyri, okay? And like I say, these are, we have none of the originals, but what we have is transcriptions of transcriptions of transcriptions, okay? Some fragments have been found, and they are typically in the Museum of the Bible in Jerusalem, where there are some pieces of fragments of some of these translations and some perhaps of the significantly the Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, and some other parts of the Old Testament. So let's get a little bit into the theology, biblical theology, we maintain that all of the books of the Bible, the 73 books, right, have two authors. Now, one author is human, and they will change from individual schools or books. And sometimes we say the book of the prophet Isaiah, it may have been written, some of it may have been written by the actual prophet Isaiah, but also from the school of Isaiah. In other words, Isaiah the prophet had his disciples, and some of his disciples wrote whatever Isaiah said, and then those disciples eventually had their own disciples. You can consider the 12 apostles, for example, which were the disciples of Christ. Those apostles themselves had other disciples who were following their teachings and so forth. So you see, it's handed on, again, organically from generation to generation, and that's what we call the oral tradition. So we talk about, in biblical theology, we talk about the school of Matthew, the school of Isaiah, the school of Jeremiah, all right? So these are individuals. At some point, some of these individuals have to actually sit down and write the stuff. For example, it's considered that Luke wrote not only his gospel, the gospel according to Luke, but also the Acts of the Apostle, which are considered a continuation of the gospel according to Luke, all right? And it's also known as the gospel of the church because it describes the primitive church, the early beginnings of the Christian church in the Middle East. And Luke himself may have been a disciple of Paul, who never knew Jesus in the flesh, but he had a much greater experience of Jesus, which was the risen Christ, his conversion experience. I'm talking about the Apostle Paul. Practically half of the New Testament, more than half of the New Testament was written by Paul or attributed to him or the school of Paul, all right? So there are all these bunch of human authors that put together the 73 books of the Bible. Again, logically, someone had to write it down at some point, right? And so there was an oral tradition before there was a written tradition. And like the movie says, something can get lost in the translation, but something also can be gained in the translation. And so it's not as accurate. And then even when they're translated, they're first transcribed, in other words, staying in the same language. Then when they're translated into another language, then that's the translation part. There's a little saying in Italian, it says, traduttore traditore. When I was in Rome studying, I used to do translations because I spoke Italian and my dad was Italian. And but it was also, it was nothing more challenging than doing a simultaneous translation going on as the speaker is speaking, you're translating that into another language for listeners, right? Like they do at the UN and such. Traduttore traditore, translator trader, because it's very difficult to maintain the full sense of what's being said, in a translation. At any rate, we know that the bulk of the Old Testament was written in Hebrew or a derivative of Hebrew, which is known as Aramaic, and then the New Testament in Greek, all right? So, from the human authors, then, we could kind of give up and throw our hands up in the air and say, well, is there any sense of any integrity to these books if they're going to be dependent on disciples of disciples and the oral tradition that it can be changed so much, is there any truth left in these writings? Well, at least from the perspective of belief, and again, of the monotheistic religions, but particularly focusing on the Judeo-Christian tradition, we can say, thanks be to God that we believe that there's also a divine author. And that divine author is the Holy Spirit. And in fact, the Trinity itself, because those three persons hang around together as one God. All of the books, the 73 books, are divinely inspired, all right? And so that's the divine author, and that's why they are called canonical, those 73 books. And so we have the guarantee at the level of belief that the core of the message is there. So These 73 books have a divine message for us. It's what we call divine revelation, which is essentially the manifestation of the three divine persons to us, right? It's a book that God has written us. It's like a letter that God has written us, a loving letter for us to stay on the straight and narrow path to make it to eternal life, okay? Reaffirming his covenant with us and the fact that he will always be with us. He will never abandon us. Jesus verbalized those words and he also lived them out to the point of surrendering his life for us and for our salvation. So again, this is theology, this is belief, all right? And, but it's a belief that has been maintained for millions of people, or I would say by millions of people over thousands of years. So the argument is, could all these people be wrong? Yeah, conceivably we could all be wrong, but there's an intuition that the message, when we read the Bible actually, and we read it dispassionately, just look at the text there and allow the text to speak to us, right? It makes a lot of sense. It's just beautiful. It's a gorgeous text that is challenging also because, like I say, it is constantly exhorting us to stay on the straight and narrow, all right, on respect for the dignity and the sanctity of all human life and even the rest of creation and so forth. But it's also a book of great hope that it talks about eternal life for each one of us. So this divine inspiration then saves the day in the sense that it gives coherence to a whole book, even though, like I say, the span between the first book of the Bible, written of the Bible, which is not necessarily Genesis chronologically, and the last book of the New Testament, which again is not necessarily the book of Revelation chronologically, right? But maybe the two letters of Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter, they span over 2,000 years, okay? So it's a library that's very rich, that has many different genres of literary narrative, and yet there is one coherent message throughout the whole of the Bible that is basically the history of salvation, salvation for humanity. All right, so let's get into it a little bit. The 46th book of the Bible, I don't expect you to know this in any luxury of detail, but just kind of recapping, summarizing so that we're all on the same page with regards to some basic knowledge about the Bible. The 46 books are divided into 4 categories. The first category, which is known as the Pentateuch, is a Greek wording, penta meaning 5, all right? And so these are, and that's where we get Pentecost also. Pentecost is the 50th day after the resurrection. So these are the first 5 books of the Bible. Then come the historical books for the Jewish people, the historical books, 16 of them. Then come the wisdom books, which are 7. And then the prophetic books, all right? The 4 major prophets, 12 minor prophets, and then 2 more books there, make 18. So that's the total of the 46. Interesting that of these 46 books, it's only within the Pentateuch, which is known as the Torah for the Jewish people. That's their sacred books, all right, the Torah. These 5 books, the narrative of origins, right, the description of our origins phylogenetically as a species, right, let us make man in our image and likeness, the creation of Adam and Eve and the story, the narrative of Adam and Eve, including the fall by disobedience and the banishment from paradise, which we now know geographically may have been equatorial Africa. Of those 46 books, it's only, the book of origin is only one, okay, which is the book of Genesis. Like I mentioned, one of the longest books of the Bible with 50 chapters. And within those 50 chapters, really only the first 10 chapters until we get to the Tower of Babel. By that point in the Bible, we already have thousands of people running around, and they're dispersed, again, theologically through the passage, the narrative, the story, the anecdote of Babel, where the confusion of languages, right? and they're dispersed. But basically, it's God's way of pointing out that at that point, there are already many different human cultures, all belonging at least to the Homo species, to the Homo genus throughout the world. But the very origin of Adam and Eve, it's only in the first 2-3 chapters of the Bible and their immediate family, right? Basically, their 3 sons and so forth that we'll look at: Cain, Abel, and then Seth. All right. So you notice that all of this potential controversy between science and religion is narrowed down to 1 out of 73 books of the Bible. And that one book, even within that one book, only the first 1 or 2 or maximum 3 chapters out of the 50 chapters of Genesis. The rest, scientifically, is not really controversial. It doesn't talk about the origins. So we have to focus then on those first few chapters of Genesis and see what is really being narrated there. Okay, so that's just a very broad overview of the Old Testament. But again, I want to emphasize that we share with the Jewish people certainly at least the books of concern, the Torah, and within those, the book of Genesis. This is very important because the book of Genesis arises, is written, it transitions from the oral to the written tradition, precisely under the Jewish people, but not the oldest chronologically, all right? Maybe 500 to 1,000 years before the time of Christ, the book of Genesis, within the Hebrew culture, way before there was Christianity as such in the incarnation of Christ. All right. The New Testament counterpart, the 27 books, are distributed into basically the Gospels, the Acts of the Apostles, a historical book, then epistles or letters. I never asked you, yeah, you can see all that. The font size is good. All right, the epistles, and then the last book of the Bible is the book of Revelation, or the apocalyptic book of eschatological, meaning eschatology is of the final end, right? Eschatology is a reference to the eschaton, to the final end of not only the earth, but the universe, and therefore also the human species as we know it here on earth organically. So we got the Gospels, which are 4. Actually, we talk about one Gospel in 4 traditions: the Matthew tradition, the Mark, Luke, and John tradition, of which 3 are known as synoptic. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are known as synoptic. They give us a synopsis of the life of Jesus, which is a summary. And then John is not synoptic. John is known more as symbolic, all right? But these are the 4 of the 27 books of the New Testament. These 4 are actually biographies in a sense. They are the ones who speak to us about the life of Jesus himself, right? The narrative of Jesus. And even of these 4, only 2 have the infancy narrative of Jesus. In other words, baby Jesus and what we know as Christmas tradition and all that. Only Matthew and Luke. Mark begins with the baptism of Christ, which is already as an adult. As a young adult, we estimate approximately maybe in his early 30s, around 30 years old. And then John is totally different, his origin. He mentions his beginning, John 1. He actually picks up on the book of Genesis, because John begins, in the beginning, the word was with God, and the word was God. And that's the Bereshit, in the beginning, in the Hebrew language, is how Genesis begins. And then he connects to the other John, John the Baptist. The word became flesh and dwelt among us. And he also talks about John the Baptist there, talking about the first chapter of John. Anyway, these are the ones that speak to us about the life of Jesus, but only a little tiny bit about Jesus, because even John, the apostle, in his at the end of his gospel will say, if everything would be written about what Jesus said and did. Keep in mind, this is John the Apostle, one of the 12 apostles who actually knew Jesus in the flesh, right? Of these 4 evangelists, only John and Matthew, the tax collector, the ex-tax collector, knew Jesus in the flesh. Mark and Luke, they're they're Roman names, and they were apostles of Paul. But they, according to the tradition, they did not know Jesus in the flesh directly, all right? And yet they are biographers. And then that means that they had sources. They had sources from the oral tradition about the life of Jesus. But anyway, John mentions at the end of his gospel, even if everything was to be written about what Jesus said and did in his lifetime, not all the books of the whole world would be sufficient to write down what he said and did, okay? So, and then John says, but this has been written for you so that you know that Jesus Christ is the Son of the living God, and so forth. So that's the end of the Gospel of John there. But anyway, they are sketches, just little passages of what Jesus said and did. And a whole religion developed from there, essentially Christianity, which is one of the two most flourishing religions of the world today, Islam being the other one. All right, and then the Acts of the Apostle, as I mentioned, is a continuation of the Gospel of Luke. And he mentions there, even Luke, as he's writing this, in the first chapter of the Acts of the Apostle, mentions, in my first book, Theophilus. Theophilus is a word, it's a symbolic word and generic word, meaning lover. Theophilus, lover of God. Philos is philia, that's where we get brotherhood, is a lover. And then Theo is God. So Theophilus is those who love God. This book is written for those who love God. In my first book, I told you about what Jesus said and did. And now I'm going to tell you about what happened after in the Acts of the Apostles, what the apostles did once Jesus rose from the dead, ascended to the right hand of the Father, and sent the Holy Spirit, the third person. So this is after the event of Pentecost, okay? And so it begins by describing the event of Pentecost, the gift of the Holy Spirit. Then along comes Paul, the 13th apostle, all right, who was persecuting the church. There is reference of Paul in the Acts of the Apostle that he was persecuting when he was Saul, a symbolic change of name in conversion, just like Simon becomes Peter, Petrus, the rock upon which the church is founded, okay? So Paul has his conversion of the risen Christ, and then begins to write several of the epistles. Some of these epistles were directly written by him. For example, Romans, which is the most mature of his writings, of Paul's writings. And it's an introduction of his letter, of his, when he's going to Rome. He writes this in anticipation of getting to Rome, to the Christian community in Rome, which were converts from Judaism also. And then all of these others, some of which he wrote directly, others were his disciples wrote them, okay? So they're from the school of Paul. Then a couple others, they're known as Catholic epistles, Philemon and Hebrews, not written by Paul, they're anonymous really. And then these others, again, from James or the school of James, this is another one of the apostles, the two letters of Peter, again, considered to be the last ones chronologically, 3 letters from John or the school of John, and then another apostle, Jude. And then finally, the book of Revelation, which is also attributed to John, okay? But it's in a code, it's written in a code fashion because it's right under the persecution of Nero, which was in the 60s, the Caesar, the Emperor Nero, which was also a pyromaniac. He burned the city of Rome because he wanted to have a lot, a particular lot where people were living, and he wanted to build his Domus Aurea, his golden house mansion there. So he burned that section and then blamed the Christians for it, so he could start the persecution at the same time. While he was up in a tower, there's a tower in Rome that is ancient, goes back 2,000 years. That's where, according to tradition, Nero went up on that tower to watch the city of Rome burn and have a delight at watching the city burning. A little unstable upstairs. Okay, anyway, we're going to go to the book of Genesis in a few minutes, but before then, just a little more of a technical notation here so that we can navigate through the Bible. All of these books are abbreviated, sometimes in single letters, sometimes in 2 or 3 letters, but the most common one is 2 letters, a capital letter and a lowercase, all right? So all of the books, whether it's the New Testament or the Old Testament, are referenced in abbreviation of 2 letters, all right? And you have these 2 slides that give you a quick reference to them. Then what follows the letter is a chapter, and then what follows the chapter with a comma typically is the verse. Now, keep in mind that back then, these books were not written with chapter and verse. That was added on later, okay? Typically, they were just read, sometimes not even punctuation, because Greek and Roman and Latin, original Greek and Latin didn't have any punctuation. It just went straight through, and you have to figure out where a new sentence began, or a new paragraph, or a new book. All right, but at some point in the tradition, somewhere, I don't know when exactly, probably 3rd, 4th, 5th century, probably after the persecutions, they were given notation with a chapter and verse for all of the books of the Bible. Okay, and they more or less follow some kind of a logical sequence of verse being an actual thought or little narrative, and then chapter gathering a cluster of verses that have a common theme upon them and so forth. So that's the notation. A little bit more, just one more thing here. Sometimes you see the specific numbers. So this is Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 and 27, which is, by the way, the narrative of the creation of the human. This is our core concern. Let us make man in our image and likeness. And have dominion over the sea, fish of the sea, the birds of the air, etc. This is what we call stewardship today, this dominion, this power. And then he created us in his image and likeness, male and female, he created us. So you notice that the distinction of the 2 sexes is also somehow tied in with the fact that we are God's image. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. So it really gives a special dignity to our sexuality or our sexual identity, because somehow it's tied in with being God's image, right? And therefore the dignity and the reverence that should be there. Sometimes instead of actual numbers, you see the verse and then an F, which means following, meaning that this is a reference to Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and following. Typically, if the letter is a single F, then it's the following verse, which would be 27, but emphasis on the 26. And if it's 2 Fs, then it means followings, several verses after. It happens that chapter 1 ends with 27, okay? But it could be, like, for example, it could be 25 FF. Then it would be 25, 26, and 27. In other words, several verses after the main verse. And that's the distinction between F and FF, just tiny minutiae. This is similar to when we put species, if we put a single P, SP, right? We abbreviate species as SP. That's a single species, we're referring to a single species when it's SP. But if it's SPP, and sometimes you see me writing that down in your summaries, SPP is a reference to two or more species, to several species, all right? The plural is FF for following verses, or PP for several species. Okay, getting too much into the weeds here. Now, let's go back to the book of Genesis, and we find that in the book of Genesis, the Pentateuch in general, all right, the first 5 books of the Bible, which again are the Torah for the Jewish people, but particularly for the book of Genesis, there are 4 main sources or 4 traditions, yes, oral traditions that pour into the Pentateuch, but very specially into the book of Genesis. At least the first 3 traditions that pour into Genesis, all right? 3 different sources. It's like 3 rivers that are merging into one main river, all right? Are known as the priestly tradition, the Yahweh's tradition, the Elohist tradition, and then the Deuteronomist tradition. I have it separated here, the Deuteronomist, because the Deuteronomist belongs only to the fifth book of the Bible, which is the fifth book of Pentateuch, which is Deuteronomy. All right. So we got, remember, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and then Deuteronomy. These are the five first books, the Pentateuch, and the Deuteronomist tradition pours into this book, and the other three traditions poured into the other four books, but mostly the book of Genesis. Where was it? Here. Now, these four different traditions, they have particular characteristics. Okay, I'm going to leave Deuteronomist out because it doesn't influence Genesis. The ones that influence Genesis are these three main sources. The priestly tradition, very important, very interesting. The priestly tradition comes from the tribe of the Levites, of the 12 tribes of Israel. So we know that God chooses the chosen people, the Jewish people, which are the 12 tribes, right? But the 12 tribes have a little chronology also. First, there's Abraham and Sarah. They were in their old age. They couldn't have children, they could not have children naturally, but there's the divine influence there, interference. And so Sarah finally has Ishmael, but has Isaac. The problem with Isaac is that before Sarah had Isaac, in their old age and their frustration and seeing that they couldn't have children, Sarah gives permission to Abraham to have intercourse with a maid who was Hagar, and Hagar was not Jewish because the Jews could not enslave each other. And so Hagar was a Bedouin, meaning that she was from the surrounding culture, but not Jewish. And the assumption is that she was much younger than Sarah, right? And she ends up having a child, Hagar does, and that is Ishmael, okay? And so Ishmael is really the firstborn of Abraham, but he's not Jewish. So the Jews don't consider Ishmael as part of their tradition. In fact, Sarah gets jealous of Hagar for being pregnant and tells, and also because Hagar is mocking Sarah, she's mocking her mistress and saying, haha, I'm pregnant and you're not. And so Sarah gets jealous and tells Abraham, send her away, get rid of her. And so Abraham kicks her out, and Hagar leaves with the baby, Ishmael, and goes into the desert. And that's the last we hear from Hagar and Ishmael in the Bible, in Genesis, except for one last little passage that Hagar also, that God also tells Hagar that your child and will have a progeny which will also be as numerous as the stars of the sea, or the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea, which is the same basic promise that God makes to Abraham as far as his children, the chosen people of Israel, which is the promise then to Isaac and then Jacob, and then from Jacob, the 12 tribes. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars of the sky and the sands of the sea. So basically, God gives the same promise to the Jewish people, and according to that narrative of the Bible in Genesis, to the Ishmaelites, the descendants of Ishmael, who are, and then Muhammad picks up on that tradition centuries later, and he says, and we are descendants of Ishmael, and we are the Ishmaelites. And so to this day, the Muslims consider themselves Ishmaelites, the Bedouins in the desert, which is Arabia, Saudi Arabia, and the Arabian Peninsula, and all that territory of the Bedouins, which are semi-nomad. And therefore, they say they are the firstborn, so they are entitled to the inheritance. And the Jews are saying, yes, Ishmael may have been the firstborn, but he was born out of adultery. He was born out of wedlock, and he was not born of a Jewess. And therefore, he's not Jew, and therefore, he's not entitled to the inheritance. The first Jew was Isaac, the son of Sarah and Joseph, born of a Jewess. And so that fight has been going on for about 3,000 years between these two cultures, right? And they can't get it together because of a different perspective on how to interpret all that. Anyway, the priestly tradition is based on the 12 tribes of Israel and the Jewish and one tribe, which is the tribe of Levite, which was the priestly tribe, the ones that ran the temple. And so they did nothing else. And that's why also they collected taxes, because they were maintained by the rest of the people who were doing the work, but they were in charge of the ritual in the temple in Jerusalem, all right? And the Shabbat was very important, the Sabbath, for the Jewish people, because that was the day of rest. The day of rest was also the day when they went to the temple to worship the one God, and there was one temple in Jerusalem that represented monotheism. Very important. Many different synagogues throughout Israel, all right? But the synagogue was a school, was a rabbinical school. The rabbi was the teacher. But the priests, and they had priests, they were Old Testament priests, they were Jewish priests, non-Catholic, non-Christian, okay? They were in charge, the priests were in charge of the ritual in the temple of worship and adoration, and the Jewish people had to present animals and plants for the ritual, all right? And all that costed money, so that's how they stayed alive. Eventually, it became a big scandal, there was corruption, and Jesus had very, very choice and harsh words for the priestly class running the temple at his time, because they had become corrupt. Not all, but many of them, unfortunately. And that was an exploitation. That was an example of religion at its worst, using religion, manipulating religion for manipulating the people. Anyway, I want to point out that the Sabbath, the Shabbat, was very important because it was a day of rest. And what is the Shabbat? The Sabbath is Saturday is the seventh day. The seventh day, right? So 6 days you have for doing your works, do your works during that time, and then on the seventh day, don't be doing any work. That was the thing. And so this priestly tradition influences Genesis 1, the first book of the Bible, because on the seventh day, what did God do? He rested. And the first 6 days, he creates all of the universe. So it's heavily influenced. Genesis 1 is heavily influenced by the priestly source, the priestly tradition of the Jewish priests in the temple. And that's Genesis 1. So it has to be read in that context of background, all right? It's very formal and structured. There's an orderly progress, and we'll see that orderly progress, how actually dovetails in with the process of evolution. Then, beginning with chapter 2, there's a second narrative that kicks in, all right? And that is from the Yahwist tradition. The Yahwist tradition is a different source, not priestly, and it is the one that is based on this, the word for God, the actual name, personal name of God, which is Yahweh, which the Hebrew people to this day are forbidden from pronouncing, because naming God was like possessing God. And because he is almighty and all powerful, he cannot be possessed. He cannot be possessed by humans, and therefore the name, direct name, just like I would say Carolina Rogelio, would not be mentioned, all right? And therefore, this Yahweh's tradition has, first of all, in ancient Hebrew, there were no vowels, it was only consonants, and these are the consonants. Yes, the Y is actually would have been a J originally, because, and even the J is Arabic, it's a Arabic I, and the Y is a Greek I, right? And then the I itself is a Latin I, so there's 3 ways of saying that. But it's a raspy sound, Yahweh. And the J also can be substituted by the H. But this was it's known as a tetragrammaton. Tetra is a reference to 4, and grammaton or grammaton is the pronunciation, the vocalization. So Yahweh is the word of God in ancient Hebrew from this tradition. And this Yahweh, this God is a very human God. God is very close to the human. This is the God who walks with Adam in the garden and the God who makes Eve out of Adam. So we see it's a very different narrative. It's very, very different narrative of the second creation of the human in Genesis 2. First Adam out of the mud, right? And then Eve out of Adam, from the rib of Adam and so forth. That's a very, very different narrative from let us make man in our image and likeness, male and female, we create him, right? And so that comes from the Yahweh's tradition, a different source altogether, and it's Genesis 2. Then there's a third tradition, which is the Elohist, which means the all-powerful, the almighty, all right? And that is an attribute of God, and that is the Elohist tradition, because God is named Elohim, Adonai Elohim. And it's a more abstract God that is a fear of God. And that picks up from Genesis 2 and 3 forward for the rest of the book of Genesis. So we have these three main traditions, the priestly, the Yahwist, and the Elohist for the book of Genesis. And we're going to be focusing now in Genesis, the first 10, but more strictly the first 3 chapters, and even more strictly the first 2 chapters of the book of Genesis. Keeping in mind these 3 different sources that influence the title, the narrative. All right, it's 11:22. Let me go into 11:30 here for a moment, and then we'll start looking at the actual text. All right. I want to address fundamentalism for a moment in this sense. We take exception to fundamentalism. In other words, fundamentalism is a literal interpretation of the Bible. What the word actually says, 100%. Okay? And the problem with fundamentalism is in the ism, in that it absolutizes the word. So we have to take it literally for what it says. The problem with that is that we find many passages that will contradict itself. There is internal contradiction and even internal violence, which cannot be to God, cannot be attributed to God, all right? So, for example, in the book of Genesis, precisely in Genesis 1, verse 19 talks about the creation of the sun and the moon, the greater light and the lesser light are created on the 4th day. Yet we know that it is the sun that defines our day, right? Chronologically, 24 hours is one spin around the earth, and that makes it day or night according to where we are in relation to the sun. So if the sun was created on the 4th day, how can we have a day before the sun was created? So it's internal contradiction. In other words, if we interpret day, the word day, as a 24-hour chronology, we're doomed. You know, how can we have a day before a day, before the day came to be by the sun, right? Therefore, what's the logical conclusion? There's an alternative way of interpreting this word day, which is a discrete period of time, but that is not, strictly speaking, 24 hours as we know it day to day. If we accept that alternative interpretation of the word day as a discrete period of time, then we're no longer locked into a day of 24 hours. Then that discrete period of time could be hundreds of years, thousands of years, millions of years, but enough time to allow for evolution to occur, you see? But of course, if we do this alternative interpretation of day as not being 24 hours, as we know a day to day, but a discrete period of time, then we're no longer interpreting the Bible literally. We have taken exception to a fundamentalistic interpretation of the Bible, okay? All right, so there are internal contradictions. Also, there are things that simply could not come from God. For example, in the person of Jesus Christ, one of the parables that Jesus uses of the groom or the groom, which is a self-reference to Jesus. He is the groom, right? And the bride is the church. So he has this little parable of the 10 virgins who are waiting for the groom, remember, from the Gospels. And he says 5 were wise and 5 were foolish. The wise brought extra oil with them, and the foolish did not bring extra oil for the lamps. And then the groom was delayed, and so they all fell asleep. And then in the middle of the night, it was announced that the groom was here, right? And so the 5 who were foolish did not bring enough oil. Then they ran out, and they were in the darkness, and they asked for oil from the wise virgins. And the wise virgin says, no, you better go to town to buy, because if we give you some of our oil, there would not be enough for you and for us. So the 5 wise ones were ready to greet the groom when he came, and they entered into the kingdom, basically. So it's a self-reference of Jesus being the groom, that he's coming anytime, and that in fact he was there, and so forth. But there are 10 virgins for the one groom. That sounds a lot like polygamy, right? And Jesus certainly was not espousing polygamy with that parable. So if we take that parable literally, this groom was entitled to 10 virgins, which was not the case. And even in the more strict sense of the wise, no, but only the wise ones, well, that's still 5. It's not down to 1, right? And the church is one church, and so forth. So if we take this passage, this anecdote of Jesus, this parable of Jesus, literally, we run aground on moral grounds of polygamy. Another one that is also pretty violent, Jesus himself, from the words of Jesus, if your eye makes you sin, pluck it out. If your hand makes you sin, cut it off, right? That's the parable that he uses, not a parable, actually a saying, right? So if we take this literally, we're doomed, right? In my 60 years of age, I could not honestly say that my hand has ever made me sin, my eye has never made me sin. I could not say that in all honesty. And if we're all honest with ourselves, I doubt that anyone could say the same. And yet, I'm not going to pluck out my eyes, and I'm not going to cut out my hand, because I am convinced that Jesus Christ does not want me to do violence to my body. He doesn't want me to mutilate my body, all right? What does he want me? He wants me to not sin. So he's using what we call emphatic language. And we have emphatic language among Hispanics also. You know, we say, oh, everyone was at the stadium watching the football game. In fact, the World Cup is estimated to be watched by about half of the world watch the World Cup, okay? But everyone doesn't fit in the stadium, because we're 7 billion people. There's no stadium that can hold 7 billion people. So not everyone is literally at the stadium. We use emphatic language. And so Jesus, maybe he was part Hispanic, he uses emphatic language also. In fact, the people in the Middle East, they're very emotional that way, right? They use emphatic language. All this to prove to you that if we're reasonable, we cannot take the Bible literally. So there's an alternative interpretation. And in fact, the alternative is what we call the sensus plenior. This is from Latin, is the fuller meaning, the deeper meaning of the passage. It's what we call sensus plenior, all right? The deeper meaning of the passage, which means that we have to use our God-given reason mind to see what is God trying to tell me with this passage. Well, he's trying to tell me, do not sin, right? Or wait for the Messiah because he's about to arrive, and so forth. I think there was a little chat somewhere. How can I find it? I thought I saw a chat. Ah, here, okay. Yes, okay. We share commonalities with many cultures of the world, especially in the Middle East. All right, so now we're going to, having this is kind of background. I've given you a compressed version of what we're normally given in full courses at the seminary on biblical theology and how to interpret the Bible in a non-fundamentalistic way, but with the background of the oral tradition before we get to the actual written tradition, which is what we're going to get into in the second half, all right? So I'm going to stop here. at 11:30, and we're going to go after the break into a source in a website that actually has, it's called the Hebrew Interlinear, has the Hebrew text with a translation into modern Hebrew, and then the English, thanks be to God, translated into English. Okay, so let's take a little break here for a moment to thaw out for us who are here physically. I hope you guys are a little warmer than we are here in the 50s inside this room, maybe 40s. So 10 minutes, okay, I'll start again at 11:40. Let me pause the recording for a moment. Okay, folks, welcome back. So we're going to be looking now at the actual narrative of, like I mentioned, the book of Genesis, chapters 1 through 10, but more directly, the first 2 chapters. And here's an example of a website that is very good. It's called Bible Hub Interlinear, and it gives us precisely it's called interlinear Hebrew that has the Hebrew writing here in black. And keep in mind that, like many ancient languages, it's written from right to left, okay? So we start here, we go this way. It's written from right to left. That's the Hebrew. And then above is the phoneticized Hebrew, how it would be pronounced, and that's precisely the first word of the Bible, Bereshit, which means in the beginning, okay? So if you memorize that one, you can say you speak one word of Hebrew, Bereshit. And then underneath here, in this orange looking color here, it's the English translation. But again, we have to put the sentence together. So in the beginning, created God the heavens and the earth was without form. So we have to put it back together, okay, so that it makes sense for us. It's kind of it's similar to, if you're in genetics, it's like the lagging strand, reading the lagging strand of the DNA and transcription. It's not the leading strand, but the lagging strand, the Okazaki pieces, remember? How they're put together in segments. All right. Okay, so this is how we're going to go to in a minute. I also want to point out, well, okay, here is, I had another slide. Oh, I guess it's in the other presentation. Okay, so let's go to this site then. Hebrew, here it is. That's the, so this is the New Testament equivalent. It's a Greek interlinear, but we want the Hebrew. Okay. And all of these are different translations of the Bible. There are many different translations, okay? But we're just gonna stick to the New International Version. So that slide that I had is just a screenshot of this first section of Genesis. In the beginning created God the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the face. Notice that the verb is missing, but it's implied. Just like in Greek and Latin, many times the verb to be is implied, it's not written. All right, so the narrative continues. The first day is light. God said, there be light, and there was light. And said God, let there be light, and there was light. So God says, there's another passage in the Gospel of John, I believe, where it says, the word of God is not inefficient. In other words, what God says, it happens. It's like that, what is that firm from Wall Street when Barney Jones speak, people listen, or something like that. There's a little phrase. Anyway, what God says, it happens, right? Because he's all powerful. And God wills it. If the word of God is like the will of God, he wills it and it happens. Later, next Saturday, we'll interpret this in a scientific way for the possibility of doing the match. But for now, I wanted to point out the creation of the human, the first creation of human. That's another thing that I want to point out in this lecture. Is two main things. First, that we don't interpret the Bible literally, but rather we use the deeper sense of the passage. So that allows for seeing a possibility of evolution happening here in the description. And secondly, that there is not one creation of the human, but several creations of the human in the book of Genesis. All right, so we're looking at the origin of human and the potential incompatibility between the religious narrative and the scientific narrative. Then we have to reevaluate and rethink, well, which creation of the human are we talking about? Genesis 1, Genesis 2, Genesis 3, because look at this. In Genesis 1, there is the creation of the human, like I mentioned, 1, 26, and 27. So over here in this brown number is the verse. We're in chapter 1, so we have to scroll all the way down. These are the 6 days of creation. I'm going to fast forward to the 6th day. At the end of each day, he says, God saw that it was good, and he blessed them. Excuse me. Evening came and morning followed, a reference to a chronology, a period of time. All the creatures, the animals, the beasts of the land and the sea. Then here, verse 26. And said God, let us, see, that us is a plural, perhaps an internal reference to the Trinity. Let us make man. Again, this man is homo, human. This is a reference to human philosophically. It's not just male, right? Because philosophically, we use man. In fact, many times we can also write it with a capital M, meaning human, the human. It's not just a reference to males, all right? So let us make the human in our image and our likeness, according to our likeness, and let them rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over livestock and all other and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Then next verse, 27, verse 27. So created God man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And then verse 28, the last one. And blessed them God, and said to them, God, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And said God, behold, I give you everything to eat and so forth. Moving forward, and saw God that everything he did was very good. And evening came and morning followed the sixth day. The sixth day, right? Oops, sorry. Then that's the end of chapter 1, the sixth day. So we see that on the sixth day, God creates man, the human, and gives them, male and female, dominion, right? This dominion we interpret as stewardship, not to destroy the earth, but to care for it, all right? And then we move to chapter 2. So that was one creation, the creation of man and woman in chapter 1. Done? Now we're in Genesis 2, okay? Thus were finished the heavens and the earth and all the host of them, and ended God on the day seventh his work, which he had done, and he rested on the day seventh from all his work which he had done. So the seventh day he rests. Now again, God does not get tired from working, so he doesn't really need to rest physically like we do. So it's symbolic language. Why the rest on the seventh day? You see that it's a direct reference to the seventh, to the Sabbath, to the Shabbat, to the day of rest. So that's why we say that Genesis 1 and this beginning of Genesis 2 is from which of those three traditions? From the priestly tradition, okay? So this is from the priestly tradition, definitely. Okay? Because on the seventh day, God rested. And then the argument of the Jewish priest at the temple and throughout Israel was, if God rested, who are you not to rest? So if God rested, you had to rest. And therefore, no work to be done on the Shabbat. And we know that they recriminated Jesus many times for doing work on the Sabbath. And then he calls them hypocrites for that, because they're sticking to the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law, and so forth. So this first book of Genesis is considered by the scholars and those in the know that it is from the priestly tradition. Then chapter 2. And blessed God day seventh, and he sanctified it, because in it he rested from all the work which had created God and accomplished. So the seventh day is blessed and sanctified it in a special way, and the Levites, the priestly class took up on that to have the people rest once a week, which was the Sabbath. All right, now we're already into verse 4 of chapter 2. And these are the generations of heaven and the earth. They were created in the day that made Yahweh, God, you see, Yahweh appearing for the first time. And it's the tetragrammaton. If you take away the A and the E, which the original Hebrew had no vowels, just the consonants, this is the tetragrammaton, okay? So here is introducing the Yahweh word for God, Yahweh God. And this is from the Yahweh's tradition. And look at how this Yahweh's tradition develops very differently from the formal structure, creation, ex nihilo, from nothing, of man and woman in the first tradition. Male and female, he created them. That made Yahweh God the earth and the heavens, and any plant of the field before was in the earth, and any herb of the field before had grown, for not had caused it to rain, Yahweh God, on the earth, and man there was not to cultivate the ground, but a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground and formed Yahweh God. Every time there's God, there's Yahweh God. Okay. Man from the dust. Man from the dust of the ground. Now notice, the word for man is Ha-Adam. All right, and that's where we get Adam. So Adam is not the first name of the first human, like we have a first name, all right? Adam means man, human. Ha-Adam. Ha-Adam means the human in Hebrew. And Ha-Adamah means the ground. So you see there's a common root, even without knowing much Hebrew, we see that there's a common root between Ha-Adam and Ha-Adamah in the Hebrew language. The human and the ground. Put that, store it in there, and we'll pick it up next week on this word to make a possible connection with the scientific evidence of the origin of life, okay? But we see that God takes the ground, takes dust from the ground and breathes, this is the Ruah, this is the breath of God, into his nostrils, the breath of life. The breath of life, and became the man a being living, all right? So Ha-Adam, again, human, Adam. So God makes Adam from the mud. He makes like a sculpture and then breathes into the nostril of man, of Adam, and makes that clay come alive, which is Adam. And planted Yahweh God a garden in Eden in the east, even gives a geographical reference. And he put there the man whom he had formed and made grow, God Yahweh, out of the ground, every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food, and the tree of life in the midst of the garden. So he begins with plants, God, right? Yahweh God puts plants first on the garden. And there, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So there's a reference to morality here, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. That was the forbidden tree, right? Now, a river went out of Eden to water the garden, and from there, it parted and became 4 headwaters. The name of the first, okay, so this is an old tradition also that is in other cultures of ancient civilizations, of these headwaters, these 4 old rivers, 4 main rivers that flow from Eden and watered all of the earth. And they brought life. Those were the life waters that flowed out of Eden to irrigate all of the earth. The Pishon, the Delion, and the Gihon, and the Cush. And 2 of these 4 are later translated into the Tigris and the Euphrates in the Fertile Crescent. And the 3rd one is translated into the Nile. And I don't know which is the 4th one, but we can see large civilizations, Mesopotamia growing out of Tigris and Euphrates, and Egypt coming out of the Nile. And I don't know which the 4th one was really, but it also mentions Assyria, which is an ancient reference to the Middle East. Oh, here, Tigris and Euphrates are mentioned here. All right. So water is mentioned as a source of origin for life in the Middle East there, in the region of the Fertile Crescent. Continue. And took God Yahweh the man and put him in the garden of Eden to tend and keep it, and commanded God Yahweh the man, saying, of every tree of the garden freely you may eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of evil and good, or of good and evil, not you shall eat. For the day that you eat that, you shall die. All right, so there's that prohibition, right? To not eat of the tree of good and evil. So by not eating of the tree of good and evil, Adam remains innocent. He doesn't know the difference between good and evil. So he remains innocent, and he also remains eternal, which are two of what is known as the preternatural gift. The preternatural gifts are the first gifts that God gave the first humans, which was eternity, immortality, and innocence. Innocence and immortality. I make a reference to the innocence when we get to closing next week, all right? Then what he does, okay, I'm gonna speed up a little bit here. God has all the animals process in front of Adam. Now keep in mind, this is God Yahweh. So this is the Yahweh's tradition, right? We're not in the priestly tradition. We're in this God who is a very human God. He walks with Adam in the garden. He makes Adam from clay, breathes into him, right? Now, what he does is he makes the animals. After he made the plants, God Yahweh makes the animals, puts the animals on earth. And he has the animals process in front of Adam. He has the animals process in front of Adam. What does Adam do to the animals? He names the animals. He names the animal. What is the name? The name is the noun, is the substantive. So he says, oh, yes, hippopotamus, and oh, no, alligator. So he knows the substance, he knows the substantive. No other animal can do that because no animal has the rational thought that we have. We have access to the essence of things, to the substance philosophically, and that's grammatically, that is the substantive, that is the noun, right? The quid est, what is it? But then what happens to Adam? Adam gets sad, right? And said God Yahweh, not as good that it should be man alone, because God, this fellow Adam, he named all of the animals, God Yahweh out of the ground, every beast of the field and every bird of the air, etc. Okay, he also mentions that God Yahweh out of the ground, every beast of the field and every bird of the air, and he brought to Adam, he made, all right? I will make him a helper, suitable. So again, we see ground, ha-arama. So the animals are also made out of the ground. Okay. So Adam, to see what he would call them, how he would name them, and whatever he called them to be, Adam, creature living, that was its name, So Adam names all the livestock and all the birds and all the wild beasts, but for Adam not was found a helper suitable. So in other words, these are all animals, they're not like me, all right? And so Adam was sad. What is God doing? He's playing a joke on Adam. Okay, he's playing a joke. He shows him all the animals, but there's none like him. So there's not a suitable helper, right? There's not a partner. And caused to fall God Yahweh a deep sleep upon Adam, and he slept. And he, the capital H, he, God Yahweh, took one of his ribs and closed up the flesh in its place and made God Yahweh the rib which he had taken from the man into a woman, Isa. Isa is woman in Hebrew, okay? And even in Old English, woman, wo, the prefix wo means of man, right? So human, of man, it's all a reference to Adam, to Ha-Adam, which is human. And now he brought her to the man and said, Adam, now, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, Isa, because out of man was taken this one, out of woman, out of man, all right, from man. So we see the complementarity of man and woman in human, all right? But you see that the narrative is very, very different from Genesis 1. So here we have a second narrative, a second creation of the human. All right, let me fast forward. Now I'm going to go back. You can go back to the interlinear if you want to read it in luxury of detail, but I'm going to go to this little table that I prepared. Because we see that in Genesis 1, there's a reference to the creation of man, of male and female. Then in Genesis 2, can you see the numbers? Yeah, okay. There's a creation of Adam and a reference from the ground, from Ha-Adamah. Then verses later, there's this creation of woman, not together, all right? So there's a discrepancy between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. If we take it literally, they don't match. It's a second story of creation of the human. Isa comes after Ha-Adamah. Okay, we call her Eve. Then, these two, they have two children, right? Cain and Abel. Cain, Qayin, and Habel. Qayin and Habel. The H is aspirated, or the H for us is mute. At any rate, that only happens in chapter 3, which is after the fall. The fall is in chapter 3. So before the fall, it's only Adam and Eve. Now, after the fall, there's Cain and Abel, the two children of Adam and Eve. Then Cain kills Abel. The first human violence is a fratricide, killing his brother. And he's banned, but then Cain marries as a wife Ishto. So Ishto, Isa is a woman and Ishto is wife. Okay. So the root is is the root of those two as a reference to the female. Cain marries and he has Enoch, right? Son of Cain. Who was the wife of Cain? We have two possibilities. Either he married his mother, which was the only other woman appearing up until that point, or he married another woman, which is not in the narrative. And where did that other woman come from? So now we have three different narratives of the creation of the human. We have Genesis 1, male and female, he created them. Genesis 2, he creates Adam, and then he creates Eve from Adam. And Genesis 3 appears the wife of Cain, which, barring incest, is another woman who is already on the scene, right? So now we have three different narratives of creation, all right? So when the fundamentalists say, oh, no, God created us, separate from the animals, well, which story of creation are you referring to? Which instance of creation? Genesis 1, Genesis 2, or Genesis 3, because they describe three different instances of creation of the human, some directly, some more indirectly. The case is that Enoch also has a son, therefore he was married, or he had a woman, and who was Enoch's wife? Was it his mother, in other words, the wife of Cain, or his grandmother, Eve, or a third woman, which is the most logical thing, right? And so on and so forth. It turns out that all of this generation, all these chronologies, is essentially the guy whose name is the man whose name, Irad, also had a son from some other woman, which we assume was none of his female relatives. And then Seth is the third son of Adam and Eve. Seth is the third son, who also married. And so again, the question begets, who did he marry? And so forth. Basically, when you start following Genesis, chapter after chapter, what you see is the name of men, except for the first woman, Eve, Hewa, which is a reference of the female in Hebrew. And none of the wives are given names, but the men are named. So, and if we follow the biological definition of species by Meyer, these women, these females, had to be human also, had to be sapiens in order for them to produce fertile offspring, right? And so forth. So I'm just trying to point out that from the biblical narrative, we have generations of humans arising on the scene gradually from one couple, several couples, and eventually a whole slew of people. Then there is this reference in chapter 6 of Genesis, which talks about the sons of God married the daughters of men, okay? And this is where, just my interpretation, but remember how I told you about the Greek influence on Hebrew Hellenism, and that was rejected as a heresy because of the polytheistic thing. But in Greek mythology, excuse me, which is very rich, the gods fall in love with women and they have intercourse with them, and the resulting children are the heroes, which look like human, but they have superhuman power. To this day, what do we have the heroes? In the comic strips, like Superman and the other one, Batman, and all these, and Superwoman, you know, they are human, but they have superhuman powers, right? So that's our today mythology, which picking up on Greek mythology 2,000 years ago. But here, it came to pass that when began men to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born to them, that saw the sons of God, daughters of men, that were beautiful, and they took for themselves, they, the gods, took for themselves wives of all, whoever they chose, yeah? Because we are the disposal of the gods, right? And said Yahweh, not shall strive my spirit with man forever, for indeed he is flesh, and yet shall be his days 120 years. Okay, so he puts a limit on the lifespan of humans, symbolically. And the Nephilim were on the earth in days those, and also after that, when came in the sons of God to the daughters of men, and they bore children to them, those were. So this those were is the reference of the Nephilim. The Nephilim are these children, these are the heroes of old, okay? The mighty men who were of old men of renown. So this could even be a reference to Hellenism influence of Greek mythology, the sons of the gods marrying the daughters of earth and producing the Nephilim, producing the mighty men, the heroes of old that were of renown. They had to do works for the gods in Greek mythology. I don't know, but it's there. It's another source yet of creation of humans that is a different narrative altogether, all right? And it departs from the chronology of the Hebrew chronology of the sons of Cain and the sons of Seth and the sons of the sons of the sons of the sons, until you get to Noah in chapter 7. And then what happens with Noah? Well, the flood happens, so the earth is wiped out, and you have this one family, Noah and his wife and his children, who begin a new kind of creation because all other creatures are wiped out, including all other humans. So Noah is like a second Adam, and his wife, who is not named, is like a second Eve, and their children are their sons and daughters in the ark, right? After the flood, they begin a new generation of humans. So did they marry each other? Did they marry their parents? Who they marry? We don't know, but they had the sons and the wives of the sons on the flood, and they start a new generation. And there's also a repetition of the same little dictum: be fertile and multiply and fill the earth and so forth and subdue the earth. So sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japhet. Happens that there are three sons, just like Adam and Eve. So there's a repetition of that narrative, 9 chapters down, all right? New fathers of nations and so forth. So earth, humans begin again, there's a new generation, beginning from the three sons of Noah. Then finally, in chapter 11 comes the Tower of Babel, which is the confusion is put by way of languages. And we can see a variation, but this one is behavioral variation by way of developing different languages, okay? So if we conceive local populations of humans throughout different geographical regions, it's logical that those populations will develop eventually their own idioms, their own dialects, which is a variation, just like Aramaic is a variation of Hebrew. And even today's Hebrew is very different. Contemporary Hebrew is very different from biblical Hebrew, just like contemporary Greek is very different from Koine Greek of the New Testament, right? And it's still Hebrew and Greek. Look at English, read Shakespeare and see if you can understand any of it. And it's written in English, but that was ancient British, right? Ancient Spanish also and so forth. So languages evolve and they evolve toward diversion, toward diversity. So symbolically represented by Babel and the beginning of the League of Nations there. So staying with the big picture, drill more into this next lecture really, but we can see from chapter 1 in Genesis, we can see a gradual creation beginning with Bereshit, in the beginning, the light, right? It's could possibly be interpreted as what is known popularly as the Big Bang, from nothing, something, from darkness and chaos, light, in fact, an incredible burst of light that contains all of the universe in that moment of singularity. And then a gradual through 6 days, through 6 chronological periods, up to the culmination of creation, which is the human, the most recent species and the most elaborate species to populate the earth. From Genesis 2, a different narrative of creation, and then from 3 to 7, more different narratives of creation of the human species, phylogenetically, right? Again, if we interpret it literally, we run aground all over the place. It doesn't make sense how God is creating the human over and over and over again. No, if we give it a more deeper interpretation, we could see the process of evolution happening there gradually, but narrated to a pre-scientific community that had no idea of the forces of evolution or anything like that. Okay. A couple more slides here. So overall, we can see that God can be the author of the universe, the author of life and of human life, but he also works within the laws that he himself created, which is the laws of nature. In fact, we see a transition that natural law is a reflection of divine law. Divine law is God's will, it's God's order, and then natural law is a flow of that. And then the third, and that link of the laws, natural law, divine law, and natural law is a reflection of divine law, and then positive law, good positive law, which is human law, the laws that legislative branches generate, should follow natural law. In other words, natural law, for example, is the right to live and so forth, to respect the human. And we know that the founding fathers of this country, for example, were natural law philosophers. They follow natural law. That was the prevailing philosophy of the time. And so the Constitution of the United States is written with the background of natural law philosophy. Okay. Today, natural law has been questioned by a number of secularist people, of which one of the brightest or the biggest exponent is Peter Singer. And basically the alternative is just emotivism, follow the pleasure and the greatest pleasure for the greatest people. Then they changed it to the greatest good to try to make an appeal to the common good. But the original dictum of Singer, Peter Singer and other contemporary secular philosophers who deny absolutely anything related to God or the supernatural, is the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. Okay, so God wills it, then it happens, right? That is really an attribute to the Almighty, who has the only one who has the power to bring this about. Regarding the human then, we can say that God creates the soul, right? But then organically that there's a process for our organic development. And that organic development at the individual level is what we call the ontogeny, or the beginning of each of us individually, which we have an origin. And then for the whole species, the phylogeny, right? But the soul is unique, individual, and eternal. That is from the perspective of belief. And it is, like I say, a belief that is in the Judeo-Christian tradition. So the human body, organically, just like any other living species, can follow an organic process of evolution, and it doesn't contradict the narrative, the biblical narrative of the creation of the human, because it's simply at a different level. It's not at the literal level of physically creating the human, but rather creating the human spirit, the human soul, which only God has the power to do. So you see, this is at the level of belief. It's not at the level of the organic process of evolution. But when we read it in a non-fundamentalistic way, there is room for the evolution process to occur without having to contradict the biblical narrative. All right, so that's basically what I have for today. This last slide just gives you some references if you want to delve more into our interpretation of the Bible, biblical studies. We start with the first document, which was at the end of the 1800s by Pope Leo XIII, Providentissimus Deus, on the study of Holy Scripture, because we see that for the past 500 years, the Protestants devoted themselves more to the study of the Bible, but again, from a fundamentalistic interpretation, simply because they are what is known as sola scriptura. Sola scriptura means only the Bible, whatever Scripture says, meaning that they put aside the tradition, because the tradition, their claim was that the tradition was corrupt, tradition with capital T, which is essentially the magisterium, the teaching of the church for those past 1500 years up until Luther and then the Protestant Reformation, okay? So for about 300 years there, from the 1500s to the 1800s, the Protestants were in general more advanced in the study of the Bible, but looking at it from a more fundamentalistic, from a more literal interpretation. And that little literal interpretation, I can tell you, definitely influenced Catholic thinking also, to the point that when Darwin was writing The Origin of Species, again in the 1800s, right, 1850s, the culture, the religious culture at the time, and the culture in general of society was a more or less literal interpretation. And that's why that narrative of the creation of the human took exception to Darwin's theory of evolution, because in the literal interpretation of the ethos of the culture of the time, it was incompatible with Darwin's description of evolution, see? And yet, just 40 years later, more or less, at the end of the 1800s, Pope Leo XIII writes an encyclical encouraging Catholic scholars to study the Bible and to study all of the aspects of the Bible, including the oral tradition, the sources, like I mentioned, the priestly source and the Elohim source and the Yahweh source and so forth. And then that was followed up about 50 years later with Pius XII, with Divino Afflante Spiritu, that the Bible is inspired by the Holy Spirit, what was believed already in the tradition, but had never been written officially, all right, as a declaration. And that was the encyclical on divine inspiration of sacred scripture and the canon of the Bible, the 73 books that I talked about and so forth. From there was established by the Vatican a commission to study the Bible in a very rigorous way with experts, theologians and biblical scholars who knew the languages, who knew ancient Hebrew and ancient Greek and so forth, to read the oldest translations that were found, right? Papyri and manuscripts that are kept, they're called codices, that's where we get the codex. There are in different museums of the world, including the Vatican Museum. And that was the Pontifical Biblical Commission, all right? Then fast forward again, another 20 years or so to Vatican II, the Second Vatican Council had one of the declarations, one of the documents of Vatican Council, Dei Verbum, on the Word of God, Dei Verbum, the Word of God, which also encourages the reading of the Bible by people and the study of the Bible. There is the Biblical Institute, the Pontifical Biblical Institute in Rome at the Gregorian University by the Jesuits, which again study the Bible in depth. So these are all references that can be sought. Declarations from the Biblical Commission, which is going on today, just a few years ago. And finally, there is one source, if you want to see some videos from EWTN, Father Pacwa specializes in that. And you can look it up on YouTube. He's got a number of writings on little videos on scripture and tradition. In other words, again, in contrast with our Protestant brothers and sisters who say sola scriptura, only the Bible, only sacred scripture, we say no, we have scripture and tradition, the two sources of divine revelation, the two sources of inspiration by God, scripture and tradition. And what we're trying to say by that is tradition with a capital T, which is essentially the teachings of the church for the past 2,000 years. The magisterium is also known as magisterium, the teaching of the church. All the documents, encyclicals, the Code of Canon Law, the Catechism that St. John Paul II commissioned and so forth, right? That's the tradition of the church. Because if we say only scripture is divinely inspired, then what happens? Well, the last book of the Bible, like I say, was written approximately 120 years after Christ, which is most likely the two letters of Paul, of Peter, especially 2 Peter. So that means that after the year 120, the Holy Spirit basically took a break and he's no longer inspiring anything or anyone, and that's it, it's the end. But no, we say and we realize that the Holy Spirit continues to inspire the church and the people of God, because there are many, many issues that are contemporary issues that the Bible had no clue. You know, there's absolutely no mention of nuclear warfare in the Bible. And yet the church takes a very definite position about nuclear warfare. Essentially, we should not have it. Okay. But there's no mention of that in the Bible, of course. So the Holy Spirit has to continue to be active in the church, and that's the tradition part. Okay, okay, folks, that's what I have for today. So I'm going to close it here. I don't know if there are any particular questions or comments to be made.
I have a question.
Okay, let me say a couple of words on the Quran for a minute, because like I mentioned, Muhammad comes on the scene about 400 years after the time of Christ. There are several ways. I'm going to say in Spanish, which I'm more familiar with. No. Quran. It's easier. That's one spelling, but they spell it with a Q. Quran. Yeah. So I don't know if any of you have read the Quran or not. I've read it. I went through it. It's really a mixture of passages from the Bible, and then it jumps to talking about a cricket or a cow, a green cow, and it goes back and forth. It's very difficult to make really any sense out of the Quran. It has a lot of Bible passages in it, even the virgin birth, for example. Islam, the Muslims believe in the virgin birth of Jesus, and they have a very high regard for Mary. In fact, one of the daughters of Muhammad was named Fatima, but still, Muhammad is a bigger prophet, a greater prophet than Jesus. And for Islam, for the Muslims, Jesus is a prophet, but Muhammad is greater, okay? And according to the tradition, oh, that's the spelling, Muhammad. He is the final prophet. See, he's from the 6th and 7th century. It's hard to tell because a lot of it was just oral tradition. He does claim to be from that Ishmaelite tradition of the Bedouins. There is one tradition in the Middle Ages that has Muhammad being a Jew who converted to Christianity and then apostatized. In other words, negated the Christian faith. And that's why he could be persecuted by both Jews and Christians, because he had denied both religions, okay? He was an apostate twice. That's one tradition that developed in the Middle Ages, in the early and Middle Ages. Apparently, he was illiterate. He really didn't know how to read or write, but he had two wives, two concubines. One was Jewish, apparently, the other one was Christian. And it is thought that these two women were a big influence in the formation of the Quran. Of course, he claims that he received the Quran directly from God, from Allah, which is their name for God. But the Quran is a mixture of many passages of the Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, like it says here, has reference to Adam, Abraham, Moses. These are all prophets. But yet, Muhammad is the greatest, okay? So it's very hard to interpret, and there are different schools. There was, there's another tradition also that claims that Muhammad was a very rigorous person, morally speaking, and that even though he had several wives, he was scandalized by the corruption that was occurring both in Judaism and in Christianity at the time. Keep in mind that this is also the age of Byzantium, of Christendom, where there was an alliance, at least on the Christian side, between the church and the state. And we had the Holy Roman Empire, and a lot of the bad habits of the monarchy filtered into the hierarchy of the church. And so there were concubines also on the side of the hierarchy of the church and so forth, and other misappropriation of funds and so forth. So one tradition has that he was scandalized by all that, and that's why he rejected both Judaism and Christianity, and essentially established his own religion, which is founded on one God, but one God at all. But my impression, at least this is Alfred Chaffee reading the Quran, my personal impression is that the God that comes out of the Quran is a capricious God. Every little chapter, in the little chapters of the Quran, every chapter begins with Allah the Magnificent and Allah the Benevolent. And then it goes on to describe how the infidels have to be killed because the infidels are offending Allah. And how are the infidels offending Allah? Well, by claiming that Allah became a human, that the creator became a creature in the person of Jesus Christ. In other words, the incarnation is their big beef, if you will, because it is the highest offense that we can give to Allah is to claim that he has become a creature. And Allah is absolutely superior to that, and therefore we are the infidels, even though we are also people of the book, right, the Bible. We are the infidels as Christians because of the belief in the incarnation. And therefore, the infidels have to be eliminated because they are locked into having to stop that offense to Allah, which is to claim that Allah has become a creature in the person of Jesus Christ. So you see the incongruency. Jesus is claimed as a prophet, but he's also like the heretic or the abomination that incarnates Allah. And so the descendants of Jesus or the followers of Jesus have to be killed. To this day, figure it out. It's basically irreconcilable. It's irreconcilable with the Jews because of Ishmael and Isaac, both from the same father and different mothers. And it's irreconcilable with Christianity because Allah, we claim that Allah became incarnate in Jesus and became a creature. And then we say in the creed, as Christians, we say incarnate, not made. And so there is the mystery of the incarnation. And that's why also why we claim from Greek philosophical categories that Jesus has two natures, has a human nature and has a divine nature. And those two natures come together harmoniously and elegantly in the one person of Jesus Christ, and he's not schizophrenic. He has these two natures, so it's the mystery of the incarnation. Yeah. But they have difficulty with that, so that's the conflict there. Read it if you can, if you want to. There are translations, of course. The original is in Arabic, which, by the way, Arabic is a single language throughout the world. They have made a big emphasis on that precisely to maintain the integrity of the Quran. So that unlike phonetic language, this is written in English, we can get the same syllabic alphabet in Spanish or any other language, right? No, Arabic is a single language throughout all of the Arabic world. And it's also written, as I understand, in one single alphabet, which is this one here, this pictoric alphabet. And it's precisely to maintain the integrity of the Quran. And the Quran also, there are certain children who are taught the Quran from the time they start growing up and can learn a language, and they memorize the Quran, so that if all of the books of the Quran were destroyed in the world, they would still have a tradition of many, many children, many, many people throughout the Arabic world who know the Quran by heart and can reproduce it again in the case that all of the written Qurans were destroyed. Yeah, this has been going on for several centuries now. Yes, I think Chris had another question, or someone in the virtual world.
Well, yeah, Chris, go ahead.
Yes. Trying to find where you all are. You're in here. Oh, here you are.
Jorge. Yeah, okay. So my question is, what do we know, or what's our belief now of the proof of the existence of the soul? Because I've heard some priests who also had a scientific background who've discovered some studies that actually show proof of the soul.
Right, okay. I'm going to touch on that in next class, but I'm going to touch on it even more at the beginning of the next course on the beginning of human life, because as I mentioned, first of all, the soul is at the level of belief, all right? So automatically, the level of belief, it goes beyond the physical into what we call the metaphysical. Philosophically, is the metaphysical realities, right? Now, the proofs are different proofs. They're philosophical proofs. They're proofs of reason. They're not going to be material, empirical proofs. And I know that some people out there, some scientists are claiming that the body, the cadaver becomes slightly lighter, less weight once a person dies, and they're assuming that the difference is attributed to the soil leaving, and those milligrams or micrograms of difference is the weight of the soil. We take exception to that as Catholics. That is kind of a literal, that would be a fundamentalistic interpretation of science, okay? That we take exception to. If we're in the metaphysical world, we're in the metaphysical world. And the only proofs that can be provided are proofs of reason, not empirical proofs of anything material, meaning anything atomic or subatomic. But I'll pick up more on the qualities of the soul as we believe them to be in the next lecture, and even more so for next course for the beginning of human life. Okay. All right. Anything else, folks? All right. Well, so that's
I
it.
actually have a question, but it's not regarding the lecture. It's regarding next semester. I'm having problems registering for the classes. It's not allowing me to register.
I see. Okay.
Grayed out.
Give me a minute. Let me stop the recording, or at least